So I want to share with you at the very beginning here, I've got my little statue of John Paul II. Okay, hopefully you know what he looks like there. I also have a copy of the book, Crossing the Threshold of Hope, which is the book that we're going to be talking about here in a little bit. This was written in 1994. It's not the only book that he wrote, but it's one of the books that does kind of stand out. And just for the record, I actually bought this at Half Price Books for $1. So if you ever go to Half Price Books, you go to the bargain aisle, you can get a lot of stuff for $1. So there's my copy there, okay? So I want to start first by taking a look at John Paul's life. And he certainly represents one of the most extraordinary lives in the history of our church. We're going to talk about a lot of saints this year, and he is one of our more modern examples of our great church leaders. All right, so if you will open your little booklet to the second page, there's a little introductory summary about him, okay? And then if you look in your packet, you'll see there is a timeline that's got some dates on it. So what we're going to do is we're going to go through the timeline and just I want you to write down the event that occurred in that year for him. So obviously, anytime you're talking about somebody, where does the story begin? It's going to talk about when they were born, okay? So let's go ahead and take a look at that. On our timeline, the first year is 1920, which was exactly 100 years ago. So this is the 100th anniversary of John Paul II's birth, okay? He was born Karol Wojtyła, okay? That was his original name, Karol Wojtyła. And he was born on May 18th. I know that's kind of small, so I'm going to try to talk loud for you, okay? And it's also in your booklet, so I mean, you can follow along in your booklet as well. He was born on May 18th, 1920, 100 years ago, in Krakow, Poland. Yes?
Can we write that?
Yeah, on your timeline above 1920, put born in Krakow, Poland. Okay? So his ethnic background, which is going to be significant in our story about him, is that he was Polish. Okay? He was Polish. He was born in Poland. Now in 1920, there was a lot going on. I mean, kind of like there's a lot going on now. But if you go back 100 years ago, this was kind of a significant time, especially for someone born in that part of Europe. What was going on in 1920? It was kind of a transitional time, but I mean, there was a lot going on. See, Harrison?
Wasn't it like World War II or World War I?
Yeah, World War I had just ended, like just a year or so earlier, okay? And of course, Europe was kind of trying to rebound from that. So obviously, the war had been devastating for everybody, every country in Europe, okay? And the economies of a lot of these countries was really in bad shape. So he was born, he came into the world at a very difficult time, okay? Very difficult time. And to add to that, and if you look in your little summary, it says that Karol, because again, that was his name, Karol Wojtyła, he experienced a lot of strife very early in his life. Can someone tell us from your little summary there about his youth? It was a difficult childhood for a few different reasons. See, Addie?
His mother died and his brother died.
Yeah, so his mother died when he was very young. He had a brother who had died, okay, when he was very young, and a sister, I believe, who had died before he was even born. And then a little bit later, his father had died. So within a few years, when he was still pretty young, he had lost pretty much all of his family, mainly to sickness, okay? And that was very difficult. Now, all of these things are going to serve him later when he, of course, becomes a leader of the church. And those hard experiences that he had actually made him tougher, okay? But he did experience loss very early on, losing family members. Okay, we're going to zoom ahead a little bit. 1939. That's another red letter date in history. 1939, which of course he would have been, 19 years old? 1939 is a red letter year in history. What was going on in 1939? That's the AJ?
Didn't World War II just start?
That's when World War II started. In fact, in 1939, in the fall, that's when Nazi Germany invaded, of all countries, Poland. Okay, so you know your history there. His country was invaded by the Nazis. And of course, if you know, the Nazis steamrolled through Poland. I mean, there was opposition, but it was easily taken over. So his country was taken over, and that's how the war got started. Okay, so in 1939, if you look at your little description there, he didn't fight in the war, okay, as a soldier, but he did work beginning in 1939 in a quarry and a chemical plant. He had a job in a quarry and a chemical plant. And this is after the Nazis had taken over Poland. Now, anyone know what a quarry is? See, Carson?
I don't know what it exactly is, but I know there's one in Geist.
Yeah, there is. Yeah, there is a quarry in Geist. Yeah, if you ever kind of peek over the fence, you can kind of see what's going on over there. It's kind of spectacular in kind of an unusual way. See, Cameron?
It's like when people like dig out and
Uh-huh.
then just like other stuff.
Yeah, well, it's a rock quarry. So yeah, they go and they mine and they pull up rock that can be used to make industrial, concrete or whatever it might be, asphalt to put down on the roads. So yeah, that's hard work. Okay, and of course in 1939 it was much more manual labor instead of having big machinery doing it. Okay, so not a fun job to have. He also worked in a chemical plant. Of course, you can kind of get an idea that would be like a factory. Now, he didn't really want to have these jobs, but he kind of had to take them. Does anyone know why people like him in Poland would have had to have worked in these kinds of jobs? And see, Anna?
Probably, I don't know.
You sure? Okay. Okay. See, AJ?
To avoid deportation to Germany.
Yeah, it was to avoid deportation, because what the Nazis would do is they went through these countries is they would take the local population and they would make them take wartime jobs. All right, these were jobs designed to help produce ammunitions and materials that the Nazis needed for their war effort. So imagine, not only is your country overrun and taken, but then you're made to serve in very difficult jobs to help the Nazi cause. Okay, so it was to avoid him being deported and probably, something even worse. Okay. All right, 1942 is the next date that's mentioned in the summary. Of course, the war was still going on at that time. And in the summary, it talks about how this is when he began studying for the priesthood. It was during the war, when he was in his early 20s, that he decided that he wanted to become a Catholic priest. He had grown up with a very strong support system prior to his parents passing away, and he had a love for the Catholic faith. Now, the war's going on. He's got these really bad jobs, okay? He actually had started his education. He had attended a college in Poland, and when the Nazis came in, they just shut it down, and he had to kind of drop out, okay? So again, it was not an easy thing. And then when he decided he wanted to become a priest, he had to do it in a clandestine fashion, okay? So do you know what that means? His study for the priesthood was done in a clandestine manner. See, Ryan? Yeah, it was secret. It was kind of done underground. There weren't seminaries around that he could go and attend in broad daylight. He had to kind of study in kind of a quiet manner. So he had books, obviously, that he studied, probably the Summa, and he would just kind of study when he could, okay? He couldn't become a priest like most people would because of the time period, okay? So, again, emphasizing that he lived in a very difficult situation. Okay, and then 1946, of course, World War II ended in 1945, and he survived it, obviously. And in 1946, he was ordained a priest at age 26. He became a Catholic priest just shortly after the war ended. And just for the record, 26, when it comes to being able to become a priest, basically means that you are right on time. Because like today, it takes 8 years for a person to become a priest. 4 years of college, and then they have to take 4 years of seminary. So even though he was in a very difficult circumstance, he worked so hard that he was still able to become a priest basically at an age when a person can be. Okay? So he was dedicated. He was dedicated to it. All right, let's zoom ahead a little bit. So he was a priest throughout the 40s and through the 50s. And then in 1958, what's it say in your little summary there? If you kind of read a little bit further ahead. Lizzie?
He was appointed auxiliary bishop of Krakow by Pope Pius
Mhm.
VII.
Okay, all right. So yeah, he was made an auxiliary bishop. An auxiliary bishop. In fact, he was the bishop of Krakow. So how appropriate that in the city that he was born at age 38, if I do the math there, he was a bishop. Okay? So he was moving up the hierarchy of the church. All right, the next date. So he was a bishop for a few years, 1964. Okay? What was going on in the church in 1964, in the early 60s? Again, your summary makes a reference to this. Early 60s Catholic Church, that was a big time. And he was right there in the middle of it. What was going on in the early 60s when it came to the Catholic Church? You might even know that without even looking at it. That was one of the significant times in the Catholic Church. Anybody see it? In your little summary there? Okay, Lucy? Well, he became a bishop, and then in 1964, as a bishop, he participated in something pretty significant. See, Lily, did you find it? Well, he is going to become eventually an archbishop, that is true, okay? But there's something that he was part of as a bishop, okay? See, Gabriel?
I helped draft in the Constitution of Vatican.
Okay. And that occurred where? It was an event. I'm trying to draw it out here. He participated in a pretty significant event where he drew up those documents. That's good. You got to start it there. See, Anna?
The Vatican II Council.
Yeah, he attended the Vatican II Council, okay, which is to date, is the last time that the Catholic Church held an ecumenical worldwide council. He participated in that. Okay, so we always hear about Vatican II, the Second Vatican Council, when the church really did make a lot of changes, which we still feel today, 50-some years later. He was part of that, okay? And you'll see the influence of the council on him later. Okay, so he was an archbishop, as you said. And then in 1978, that was another really big year for him. It was a big year for Reggie Jackson also, if you're a baseball fan. 1978, pretty good year for Carol Wojtyla. See, Lizzie?
At the age of 58, he took the name of John Paul II.
Okay, this is when he became Pope. Okay? This is when he was elected Pope. Now, I want to mention this. He was elected in October of that year at age 58. He was at that time, he was the youngest person to be elected Pope. It also was significant that he was the first non-Italian Pope in several hundred years. Okay? Being from Poland, of course, he had that ethnic background. That was a big deal. Okay? The other thing about his election, and it says this in your summary a little bit, is that he actually was not the first person to be elected. Paul VI had been Pope for about 15 years. And when he died, of course, they had to elect a new Pope. And they did. Okay? And that Pope was named John Paul I. And he was Pope for exactly 1 month. And then you know what happened? He died. Okay? He died. And so they had to elect another Pope. So if you could imagine, you get a Pope, it's a big deal. 30 days later, he dies of an illness. Okay? And it's like, oh, we got to elect another one. So that's how Carol was selected to become Pope. And of course, in honor of John Paul I, who really never got to do anything, he took the name John Paul II. Okay? So the little significant there. So he became Pope in 1978. All right. And then in 1981, 3 years into his pontificate as Pope, something else happened that was very significant. And you might know this even without looking at the summary, because we've talked about this just not too long ago. See, Carson?
He was wounded by a Turkish gun.
Yeah, this is when he was shot. The assassination attempt on his life in 1981. We talked about that. Okay, the Turkish gunman. And of course, he was wounded severely, but he survived it. Okay, that was in April of 1981, early 1981 when that occurred, and that had a big shape on his life as well. Okay, he of course recovered, and if you remember, he went to the jail, the prison where the gunman was being kept, and remember, publicly forgave him, and privately. You know, he spoke with him privately, but then also publicly forgave him. Okay, all right, 1994. Let's zoom ahead a little bit. 1994 is the year that this book that we're going to be looking at, Crossing the Threshold of Hope, was published. And we're going to talk a little bit about that here in just a little bit, about why the book was written. But in 1994, Crossing the Threshold of Hope was published. It was the 15th, actually it would have been the 16th year by the time it came out, but it was the 15th year of his pontificate. And it was kind of part of a way to kind of celebrate that. And that's why the book was released. All right, let's zoom ahead a little bit more. In 2005, CJR?
He died.
Is when he died. Okay? Yes, that is right. That's when he passed away. It was actually April 2nd at age 85. He had a very long pontificate. Okay? In fact, if you do the math, 1978 to 2005 is roughly, well, not quite 30. Okay? Not quite 29. All right? He'd be about 27. He was just short of 27. You've got to use those great St. Simon math skills there. Okay? Now you might say, oh, okay, 27 years, big deal. Well, that's a big deal because if you were to look at the history of the papacy, most popes don't serve very long. Okay? I mean, they usually get elected when they're older, and of course, you know, life expectancy is better today than it was 100 or 200 years ago. But usually, popes don't serve very long. And to serve for almost 30 years, that was really, really significant. Okay? I can kind of tell you from my perspective, he became pope when I was 7, and he was pope until, you know, I was in my almost mid-30s. I mean, he was the only pope I ever really remembered. And when he died in 2005, it was like, oh my gosh, I can't believe there's going to be a new pope. All right? Because he was the only one that I ever really remembered. So that was pretty significant, and he did a lot during that time. Okay? As we're going to talk more about in the book. All right, 2011, he was beatified, which means he became blessed, and then in 2014, 3 years after that, you might be able to guess this if you didn't actually read it. See, Lizzie? He was canonized, and that's why he is St. John Paul II. Okay? He was beatified and canonized by Pope Francis, so this would have been 6 years ago. And his feast day is October 22nd. Okay? And if you look carefully, you'll see that his feast day is not the day he died. It's the day that he was elected Pope. Okay? You know, sometimes saints, their feast day is the day they died and entered heaven, we believe. But in his case, it was when he became Pope. Okay? So, a life well lived. All right? A great life that was very well lived, no doubt about that. Okay? All right, I want to go ahead and give you a little background about the book that we're going to be looking at, and then we're going to take a look at the questions that we have in your packet, and you're going to be reading some parts of it. Okay? So there's actually an interesting story about crossing the threshold of hope. And there's a little summary in your booklet, but we're going to talk about it real quickly. So actually, the story behind the book goes back to 1993. And that was the 15th anniversary of John Paul's pontificate as Pope. And they had planned to have this worldwide live interview that they were going to do. And that had never been done before. A Pope was going to sit down with a journalist, and the man who was going to do it was an Italian journalist named Vittorio Missori. And he was very well respected, and the Pope was willing to sit down and give a live audience interview that was going to be recorded and sent out all around the world. Well, the Pope at the time was very busy, okay? He was organizing at that time the First World Youth Day, and of course, as we're going to talk about, he was a very well-traveled Pope. He kept busy, okay? And they just couldn't get it to happen, okay? And the Pope contacted Missouri and said, I'm really sorry that we haven't been able to do this big interview. I mean, it's really been promoted. So I'll tell you what. You send me the questions that you were going to ask me if we did the live interview. And I'll look at them and I'll answer them as best I can, and then I'll give you my answers in writing, and you can do what you want with them, your choice, okay? If you want to make a documentary, you can do that, whatever. Well, they decided eventually, because, he did give him his answers to the questions that he had wrote. They said, well, how about a book? Okay, let's make it into a book. And that's exactly what happened. So Vittorio Missori, with John Paul's help, was able to compile this collection of answers. So one of the things that makes the book kind of unique is that it is written in a question and answer format. It's Q&A. Missori has a question that he was going to ask the Pope, and then John Paul gives his answer. Okay, and he's very candid in the book as well. So that made the book kind of unique. Okay, in that it was an interview from a journalist to a pope, and the fact that John Paul said, I'll answer any question that you have. Okay, and that's kind of unusual. So it is a very different kind of book. Now, the nice thing about it is, if you want to read it cover to cover, you can, or if there's just certain topics or questions that you see that are interesting, you can just look at those. Okay, and in fact, that's what we're going to be doing. We're not going to be reading or studying the entire book. I've picked out 11 questions which correspond roughly with topics that John Paul II dealt with. So we're going to be taking a look at those questions, and in doing so, we're not only going to get some great answers, but some more insight into John Paul II's ministry as Pope. Okay? All right, so if you look in your packet, there are a set of reading questions that we're going to look at, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to assign to each of you a couple of the questions, okay? So you're not going to even read the whole book that you have in front of you. You're going to be reading part of it, and then we're going to discuss each of them, okay? So I'm going to stop the video for a moment.